Buffaloes are now so numerous that from an eminence we discovered more than we had ever seen before at one time. And if it be not impossible to calculate the moving multitude which darkened the whole plains, we are convinced that 20,000 would be no exaggerated number.
Those bison came to symbolize the strength and wild spirit of America.
It's strong, it's beautiful, it's dynamic, it's majestic.
But for all its imposing strength, the bison is a vulnerable species that very nearly disappeared from the prairie a century ago.
They were exploited just like trees, and everybody looked around and, where are they? Geez, maybe we should have thought about this.
Against all odds, American bison survived near extinction and are today considered a conservation success story. There are now nearly 500,000 bison living on the Great Plains.
I do believe that buffalo can serve as a metaphor for all wild things. Buffalo make a perfect metaphor for what we're missing, what's going extinct every year.
The story of what happened to bison is a complex story. And it's a story that almost looks like it's a kind of a perfect storm.
When Lewis and Clark arrived on the Great Plains in 1804, tens of millions of bison roamed the central grasslands of the continent.
What they saw had to have been something much like what had been there for centuries.
But in the final decades of the 1800s, cultural change swept across the prairie, devastating Plains Indian people and pushing bison to the brink of destruction. That change arrived in the form of drought, Euro-American settlers, horses, trains, disease, and hide hunters.
There's a lot of factors that went to this near extinction. Basically, it was greed. People figured out that there was value in the hides, and those hides went to power machines of the Industrial Revolution. They made belts, what we use rubber for now.
European colonization of the Americas treats animals and wildlife as this congress of resources. We make them into commodities that we can exploit at our whim.
All of a sudden, this flow of energy came off the Great Plains. People forget that a buffalo really is a machine to process this grass. Processes it into buffalo meat. Hides, all the parts of the buffalo have been recycled for generations and hundreds of years and thousands of years. But that energy never leaves that valley. All of a sudden it started leaving that valley. Basically, we started the process of mining the Great Plains of its energy.
After the Civil War, trains brought west thousands of former soldiers turned hide hunters.
This is the largest destruction of wildlife that's discoverable in modern world history. I mean, we can't find anything that measures up to the destruction of animals that was taking place in the West in the years after the Civil War.
When white hunters started coming in, they were just killing at random. And people would do things like shooting bison from trains just to watch them fall, just killing to kill.
Up until this time, bison sustained Plains Indian people with meat for food and hides for clothing and lodges.
Understanding the buffalo and the importance of the buffalo for our food, for our shelter, for our tools, for our games, for our survival, we've always depended on the buffalo. And so it was never about overkilling.
Bison were also of spiritual importance and were considered brothers and sisters of the Plains people. The Lakota referred to them as the Buffalo Nation.
In Lakota, we call the buffalo Ta. Umaha people, they acknowledge the buffalo as Te. You hear about Tatanka, but Tanka is something that's huge, it's big. And so we're acknowledging the buffalo for the size of our relative. We were both in the millions, and we almost disappeared.
The slaughter that was taking place as a result of the market hunt was so egregious, many people noticed it. They noticed what was happening.
In early spring 1886, William T. Hornaday, chief taxidermist at the U.S. National Museum, headed west in search of bison. On the prairies where millions had once ranged, Hornaday and the Smithsonian Institution Buffalo outfit found no live animals.
He wants a large bull, he wants cows, he wants calves. He and the Smithsonian were convinced that bison were probably going to completely go extinct. And he thinks there are probably fewer than 1,000 buffalo all over the West.
Traveling northward along the Missouri, they were confronted with a vast layer of skeletons, ghastly monuments of slaughter, bleaching in the sun.
Between 1804, when Lewis and Clark described the West, and 1886, not even 100 years, when Hornaday describes it, he does that very famous map in his The Extermination of the American Bison, where he basically shows this vast ocean of animals, the Great Bison Savanna. The best metaphor for it is it's an ocean that's evaporating into a final handful of little pools, little puddles. And there's a final little puddle down in the upper Texas Panhandle and a final little puddle in eastern Montana. And that's basically the end of it.
Upon returning to Washington, D.C., Hornaday hatched an elaborate plan to raise awareness about the destruction of the species. He would mount a family group for the U.S. National Museum and found a national zoo in Washington, D.C., with bison as some of its first residents. Hornaday's bison exhibit represented the very height of taxidermy, featuring, as the Washington Star trumpeted, real buffalo grass, real Montana dirt, and real buffaloes.
I think it's important to be able to see a bison close up, to be close enough to really see that hair, the thickness of it, to see how well adapted it is for its environment. I mean, it's meant to be here.
In the final years of the 19th century, it was estimated that there were only 23 remaining bison in Yellowstone National Park and about 800 in private herds. The Pablo Allard herd, established by Samuel Walking Coyote, a Kalispel Indian, became critical to preserving the species' genetic diversity.
He had these calves who had lost their mothers in the hunt follow him back from eastern Montana to western Montana. He had a couple of cow calves and a couple of bull calves, and they became the nucleus of a famous herd of bison. We probably wouldn't have bison today if it hadn't been for the actions of some of those very prescient Native people in the 1880s and 1890s who make sure that we don't lose them.
Recognizing the value of herds like Pablo Allard, Hornaday and Theodore Roosevelt convinced Congress to establish federally protected herds in Yellowstone, Oklahoma, and Montana. But this came at a cost to the Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation, when treaty land was taken from them to establish the national bison herd.
What we're trying to do here on this ranch is to keep our buffalo as wild as is humanly possible, so that if there is a genuine regeneration of wild buffalo, that there'll be a pocket like Walking Coyote's buffalo were. And I think that by doing that, when the time comes for the Serengeti to actually come back, there'll be animals that are capable of making that transition.
There are now only 8 major conservation herds that serve as the source of genetic diversity for the species, which is critical to their survival. In order to preserve this diversity, researchers are working to establish new herds of bison across the plains.
The day the animals arrived, it was like a fairy tale. Our goal is to restore the prairie back to its historic level. As we looked around, there was one thing that was noticeably missing, and that was the dominant species, and that being American buffalo or bison.
The Crane Trust bison herd, released in 2015, now ranges over native tall grass prairie on Mormon and Shoemaker Islands in the Platte River ecosystem.
We never even dreamt of having access to a genetically pure herd.
Out of the 8 major conservation herds left, I think we have 6 out of those 8 well represented in our herd. We just need to get 10 calves. We got 18 to choose from.
In order to track purity and diversity,
Yeah, she's ready.
researchers collect blood samples and tail hair follicles to test the DNA of each bison. This genetic data helps researchers make informed decisions that will benefit the long-term health of the species.
What we're doing is trying to create sort of a very diverse herd. And our aim is not just purity as much as it is diversity.
More than a century ago, ranchers crossbred bison with cattle. Cattle DNA and low genetic diversity can have a long-term negative effect on the species.
You're gonna get blood from the tail?
Researchers selectively breed bison in conservation herds to eliminate cattle DNA and maximize diversity.
For the species to truly be itself and thrive, we're gonna start to see issues if we don't increase the diversity.
The return of this keystone species to the prairie ecosystem is critical, not only for their survival, but for the survival of the plants and animals that depend on them.
To put these animals back into the ecosystem that they belong in is repairing something that we really broke.
It's interesting to be living in our time because we're living in a time when there are more bison in North America than there have been at any time since probably about 1880 or 1881.
Although bison now only inhabit islands of prairie habitat across the Great Plains, no longer moving from water to water, they endure. The dream of the buffalo is not over.
We've been on a long journey with our relative, Tatanka Oyate. It's all about understanding the responsibilities of two-leggeds, of taking care of our relative. The Buffalo Nation has always been here.